You are now watching On Point, a news and public affairs show from California State University Northridge.
Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm your host, Carolina Tello, and today we will dive into the topics of Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly known as Columbus Day, which was celebrated on October 9th. The purpose of the holiday is to recognize the painful history Indigenous people have faced and to celebrate their communities. This day highlights all the many atrocities natives have had to endure since Christopher Columbus discovered America. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different and doing a roundtable talk. Right now I am here with Miriam Frutos Rodriguez, who is an On Point CSUN student, and Marc Monroy. The first thing I want to talk about is basically what you think about when you hear the name Christopher Columbus.
So I think about when I was back in middle school, high school, the history that our teachers taught us back then about Columbus arriving to America, discovering the land, and then through that event, how they started gathering all of the indigenous people and teaching them to be civilized.
Yeah, I agree with the point that Miriam made about them teaching them in school. They always glorify how Christopher Columbus, he's the first one who have discovered America, when in fact it wasn't that. He was the first one who discovered it pretty much for the Europeans. There was Native Americans way before Christopher Columbus, dating back all the way to the Ice Age. The point that connects Alaska between Russia, that point that connects Russia and Alaska, during the Ice Age, there was a path to actually get across. So when the Russians actually went up and traveled to that part, they obviously stayed there. And obviously as the Ice Age kind of went down and all the ice started to melt, that part of those Russians got locked into that part and basically formed their own civilization. So the fact that America has always said that Christopher Columbus is the first one to discover America, I feel like that's not quite right. But I also feel like celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day is also important because it highlights the fact that, hey, Indigenous people were here before Christopher Columbus, and it highlights the fact that they also were pretty much brutally murdered throughout the course of how America was formed.
So then, what do you think about the change from Christopher Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day?
So at first I didn't really understand it, to be honest. And again, I feel like it was because of that narrative that I was fed from middle school and high school. But then as I started diving in more into it and just reading different books, and then I started going into college, I kind of understood that these people, like Marc said, had been here years before Columbus arrived, years before anybody knew this land existed. And to have a day to honor them and to honor that they existed and everything that happened after Columbus arrived, I think it's a very significant day to have. So I personally do believe that it's made an impact, and I feel like within that community, just having them know that they're recognized, that they're here, it's very important.
Yeah, some states have actually completely ignored the fact that Christopher Columbus Day is a holiday. States such as New Mexico and Maine, and also the District of Columbia, they don't recognize Columbus Day anymore, and they only focus on Indigenous People Day. Well, I disagree with what they do. I agree with celebrating both. The reason I say that is because, yes, Indigenous Day, people were here before Christopher Columbus, but the importance of Christopher Columbus coming to the Americas is really important for a lot of majority Americans, because the majority of Americans are descendants from the Europeans. So that's why I feel like, yeah, know your history.
So do you think this day could be something that could show solidarity with Indigenous people, something that can support them, and how do you feel about that?
Oh, definitely. Like Marc said, it's important to know both sides of the history, not just the one side. You have to have what Columbus Day initially meant, and then all of the events that happened with that first event. So the community can show support to the Indigenous community by acknowledging and celebrating it. I know that not all the states have that where they fully celebrate it. Like Marc mentioned, some of them completely just tossed out Columbus Day, and now it's just focusing on Indigenous Peoples Day. But I think by doing that, they are missing that little bit of history. So it is important to have both sides.
Yeah, I always agree in a more United States, pretty much, because if you focus on, he celebrates Christopher Columbus Day, he's a racist or he's something like that. that happened centuries ago. The people who are here now weren't involved with what actually happened that happened centuries ago. So I do believe in a more kind of united and celebrate both holidays.
So do you think maybe it's the educational system that's keeping people from realizing that it's not maybe negative to have a change in holiday, but to just acknowledge the fact that there's a reason for this change?
I do acknowledge the fact that they are adding Indigenous Peoples Day. They always focus on Christopher Columbus, but it's always important to educate people, especially the newer generations. Since I'm part of Generation Z, we were kind of like the last generation of who was pretty much taught like, oh, Christopher Columbus Day is like, oh, he discovered America, or Thanksgiving, it was a day of giving, when in reality it really wasn't. But I feel like the newer generation, it's more important for them to like know about both sides.
And then just to add on to what Mark's saying, I think with schools it's a very fine line because you don't just have the school boards and the teachers and the students. A lot of the times you have the parents who are, I don't want my kids learning this, or this may have been a very atrocious event, and I think they're too young to be exposed to anything like that. So when you start to add that in with charter schools, especially because the parents do fund charter private schools, anything that gets funded by the parents, I think that's kind of a harder thing to change versus with public schools. I think it may be a little bit easier to shift, not change it completely, but shift it over to have everybody just learn both sides of the history, because ultimately the parents can go up to the school board. And I think as more of us, like Mark said, we're growing out, we're getting into these professions, and more teachers are joining the workforce that are younger, that kind of understand there's the two sides to history. I think that's really going to have an impact on the future generations who are getting into grade school and kind of how they see U.S. history.
So our reporter, Miriam Frutos, actually got to talk to some people on the street about their opinions on the day holiday change. So let's go look at that.
What are your thoughts on the transition from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day?
It's always been Columbus Day, so people still say it's Columbus Day.
I don't think it was needed to change. I appreciated the fact that we had Columbus Day, and Columbus discovered America.
As a kid growing up in California, we never really got Columbus Day off, so it's not something I've ever celebrated, and I'd rather celebrate Indigenous people than Columbus.
We should kind of honor that. I know people don't want to stick to that because they feel like that he slaughtered Indians and stuff like that.
I think that was a good change. Yeah, we gave credit to Christopher Columbus for finding this place, but there were people probably thousands of years before he came here.
When we come back, we'll further discuss the issues that we saw in the video. Thank you for watching On Point.
When it comes to making plans, you are the best. The same way you plan each detail for those moments. Start planning to protect you and your loved ones from a natural disaster. Protecting your family is the best plan you can make.
Welcome back, and thank you for watching On Point. We will discuss what we just saw from Miriam Frutos. I want to discuss mainly the reactions they had. Like, what are your initial thoughts on what they had to say?
I was taken back, to be quite honest with you. I've been so used to celebrating it as Indigenous Peoples Day that some of the reactions on there, where one of the men acknowledges, like, yeah, he did this and he did that, but I still think it's important to celebrate it. It kind of threw me off for a loop. It was not an answer I was expecting, but at the same time, it allowed me to bring it back to just knowing that you have to have both sides of history, not just the one-sided.
Yeah, I enjoy that there's mixed reactions. It shows that there's always different opinions out there, and we have to accept the fact that there are different opinions. But I do agree with some of what they said, that, hey, yeah, some people were here before that, so it's important to also recognize the fact that, yeah, Indigenous Day does exist. But I know one of the girls mentioned, like, oh, yeah, let's completely just focus on Indigenous Peoples Day and not even celebrate Christopher Columbus Day. I disagree with that fact respectfully. I feel that both of the holidays should be recognized because I feel that people need to know both histories.
So what do you think the issues are on why they think that way? Is there a specific reason you think they have that opinion?
I think the reason that they always have this opinion is because most people go off of what other people say, since they don't really like to be pretty much what people say, not to get controversial or anything. People always try to cancel you if you say something that they don't like. So I always think that people try to always feed the narrative to what is trending right now and what people are feeding people pretty much. And I think they always try to stay with that. And I think they're scared that if they don't say it, then they're going to get canceled or people won't like them.
And then just to jump into that, I hadn't thought about the cancel part at all. My thought went into the demographic, because if you look at it, both of the gentlemen that said they were for keeping it as Columbus Day were around the same age. Whereas when I asked the other two individuals, the woman and the younger guy, they were both kind of like, yeah, let's toss it out and just move it to fully Indigenous Peoples Day. So my immediate reaction was like, it was because of their upbringing and what they were taught and what their parents were taught, that they have the different beliefs.
And with this change, do you think there are some misconceptions of this holiday? Think like people have certain beliefs on it because they think a certain way on it? Like, what are some like misconceptions you think they have?
Misconceptions of Indigenous or Christopher or both?
Both, yeah.
Both. Yeah, I feel like people always have misconceptions of everything. You know, not everybody doesn't know exactly what happened since it happened so many years ago. It's usually what's fed through the school system, you know. And I do feel that there is misconceptions with a lot of things since people read, and a lot of people read and they automatically assume, oh yeah, that's right, and I have to go with that one. So that's my feeling. I think there's misconceptions with not even just Indigenous Day or Christopher Columbus Day, but with everything we have in the world.
Yeah, there's definitely room for improvement to bring it all and understand that it's both things. It's not one or the other. And I think that's where people really get upset. I strongly do believe it's because of the upbringing and kind of what they learned. And you, in a way, they're seeing it as you're telling me that what I learned was wrong. So there's definitely a lot of room for narrative to bring in both sides so that both parties kind of meet in the middle, understand that it's both things that happen.
Yeah, and to add to that fact, the scareness of people having like, oh no, they're wrong. People don't like being wrong. I'm going to be honest. The majority of people do not like being wrong. I'll be completely honest. I don't like being wrong, but I admit to being wrong. But the majority of people that think, oh, we were wrong to teach this, and like, oh no, yeah, we have to celebrate only Christopher or only Indigenous People Day because the other side is wrong, and all that.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's not about a wrong or right. It's just about learning the true history of the U.S.
Thank you. Let's hold that thought right there. And I want to go to reporter Miriam Frutos, who actually got to visit Sherman Indian School. Let's take a look.
Earlier this month, we celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day. However, this has not always been the case. Throughout U.S. history, Indigenous people have faced adversities. Their culture has not always been accepted or embraced, but rather nearly eradicated by means like boarding schools and residential schools.
The government felt that they weren't being assimilated at a fast enough pace. So based on Captain Richard Henry Pratt's experiences with prisoners in Fort Marion, he conceived of a school where young Native children could be separated from their communities and families and taught American morals and values.
Schools like Sherman Indian started out as a place where kids will learn Western values and work for very minimal pay. Their purpose was to erase Indigenous values. The schools reported to the federal government, unlike residential schools, which report to religious organizations. That was what allowed for change to happen.
They transformed today. They don't resemble anything really of what they used to 100 years ago. Now, through various shifts in the social landscape, in legislation for Native people, these schools now represent a place where Native culture is celebrated.
Today, Sherman Indian School remains open, but now as a place that values and appreciates Indigenous people's culture. Some of their curriculum includes tribal law, Indigenous languages, and culinary arts. Miriam Frutos, Burbank, California, on point.
So, Miriam, I want to dive into what you learned about the school. Can you tell us more and elaborate on that?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I learned was the difference between a boarding school and then a residential school. Prior to speaking to Amanda, I was not aware of the two. She dived into the residential schools were really funded by religious organizations. So they didn't have anybody to hold them accountable for anything that was going on. Sherman Indian School was actually not funded. It's a boarding school, so it wasn't funded by any religious organization. And that's what allowed for change to really happen. People to start advocating. They had to answer to some sort of government. And that's where you start to see the shift of we're taking kids away from their homes and putting them into these schools for 24 hours and using food as the reason. Basically, from what Amanda mentioned, they either could give up their kid or they could give up the rations for their month. And I think that's something that I had not thought of, and I'm glad I learned the difference.
Now, Mark, what are your thoughts on watching that video?
Yeah, I know. I definitely agree with like what Miriam just said right now. Taking away the rations or you take away the kid. But you gotta know that the government has done a lot of bad things in the past, and I don't agree with what the government has done in the past, especially for Native Americans. But yet again, it did happen like hundreds of years ago. But it's always important to know what happened so it doesn't repeat itself.
This holiday isn't just a celebration, but it's an opportunity to educate people. How could we do that today, based off of what you saw from the video?
So one thing I would suggest is going through museums and archives. That school, Sherman Indian School, is still operates today. Obviously, it has a tremendous change. It's nothing like what it started. And there's a lot of people whose parents were in that school at one point who go back. There's a lot of Native organizations that donate to that school being in what it is. I think it's more important to just know that those spaces exist and explore them. I was lucky enough that this exhibition was at the Autry Museum and it's going to be there until 2024. So definitely an opportunity to explore.
Yeah, I think a new way to like learn it, is especially for the kids who are in elementary school right now. I don't know if they still do field trips nowadays. I've been out of school for who knows how long from elementary school, but definitely go on field trips to these places just so you can learn about the history of it and know what happened.
And how do you think all educational institutions can better incorporate Native history to help further educate students?
In like textbooks and all that?
Yeah, in textbooks or organizations at school.
Yeah, I feel like maybe adding, in elementary school and even in middle school, we learn about world history and American history. I think the U.S. history, it is important that we know what happened, how the U.S. was formed and how the wars were fought, the 1800s, the 1900s, and all that stuff like 9/11 in the early 2000s. But I feel like maybe adding the way that Native Americans were treated is also another thing that they should focus on to add in U.S. history. But I don't necessarily think add it into elementary schools. I think it's a bit early on for them to learn about like mass genocides. I think middle school U.S. history is the perfect place to start introducing what really happened.
So to kind of add on to that, it really threw me back into when I was in middle school. We did a project that took about a week or two. It was for the Trail of Tears, where basically you were dealt a card, and every day we had to go in and pick a different card, and it would tell us it would pick from events that actually happened, except we were in a way reliving those events through this school project. So I think school projects like that engage you, that have you really connected with your team, that make you choose like, well, today you're near a lake. Do you want to give water to the horses, or would you rather use that water for something else? I think projects like that really allow for kids to engage and learn a lot more.
And to add on to that, like when I was in elementary school, I went to a World War II museum, and they showed us things like Auschwitz and what the Jewish people went through during those times. And we even got the opportunity to meet an actual person, a Jewish person who was in the concentration camps during World War II. And I think that those types of projects that Miriam mentioned, I think that is very important for students to actually learn about and visit museums about Native Americans and learn about what happened.
So when we come back, we'll further discuss more about this topic. Thank you for watching On Point.
Everybody in my house knows how to ride a bike except me. People ask, how your children learn how to ride a bike and you didn't? I didn't teach them. I just created an environment where they taught themselves, and all I had to do was be there.
Hello, and thank you for watching On Point. I'm here with Marc Monroy and Miriam Frutos Rodriguez. Columbus Day to many people, and even our Generation Z, has been taught in schools for the better part of a century now. The first time it was established as a holiday was in 1937, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized it as a holiday of festivities. It wasn't until 1971 where it was turned into a federal holiday. But now, in the 21st century, it's been turned into a controversial day. In some states, it's recognized, but not all states. Some states, such as New Mexico and Maine, go as far as to replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. So, what are you guys' thoughts on not all states or countries recognizing this day as Indigenous Peoples Day?
I mentioned this before. I disagree with it. I don't think it's right to just completely disregard Columbus Day, because if you disregard Columbus Day and teaching it and not necessarily celebrating but recognizing the day as a holiday, I think that for the future generations, it's going to leave out an important fact for future generations to come. Luckily we were able to learn about it, but for future generations, if they don't know about this fact, then they're just not going to know true history or like what actually happened if they just know about Indigenous Day and not Christopher Columbus.
Yeah, I think you need one to support the other. Because if you just completely delete Columbus Day and what he did, and basically that was the point that caused every other event. So how are you going to teach about Indigenous Peoples Day, what it means, and why it's important to recognize it, if you're not going to say why? People are going to start to question, well, why do we celebrate this? Just kind of how we started questioning, well, why do we celebrate Columbus and not Indigenous Peoples Day? I think you're going to have that shift if you leave one part of it out. And ultimately, it's about learning the true history, not the one side.
Yeah, to add on to that, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. What happened in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s is Hitler basically just completely disregarded what actually happened in the past and fed people about Jewish hate and propaganda. And, I think what we see today now is also censorship for one side. And I think that's causing not necessarily the most positive mindset for people who are disregarding the actual truth and history and are just being fed propaganda or just one side, because I think it's important to know both sides.
Adding on to the information of knowing both sides, I think it's also important to acknowledge that there aren't just Native Americans or Native Indians here in America, but there's Natives in all countries. What are your thoughts on learning and being taught more about that?
I think it's something we need. As someone who grew up for the first 9 years of my life in Mexico, the way that a lot of the country sees Indigenous people, back 2000, I'm talking 2003, haven't been back, so I don't know what the situation is exactly like right now. But back then, they do see them as below the standard human of anything. And it kind of boggles my mind, because at the end of the day, if you trace it, no matter who your parents were, you're going to have some sort of Indigenous trace that dates back millions, hundreds of years, whatever have you. And it's something we have to start accepting across the continent, not just in one specific area.
Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of people like to say, oh, America only did this. I mean, there were slaves and natives being murdered across the entire world, not just America. Obviously, it is important to prioritize American history. But, I do have Indigenous blood in me. My mom's side is more of the Indigenous side. And my dad's side, it was more of the conquistadores back in the 1500s, the Spanish and the French invading and all that. But I think it is important to just know about that and know that not just America did this, but the entire world did it.
I also want to talk about representation, how is Native Americans represented today? How do you, like, what do you guys see?
I think it's completely different than what it was 100 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago. You know, we celebrate them more now today, and I notice them being treated more fairly now today, especially since they have gotten up and started having to speak out about it and all that. And I definitely feel that they are treated way better today than what they were 100, 200, 300 years ago.
See, when you brought up representation, my mind immediately went to what we see in movies, what we see in commercials, and it went back to the Dior perfume with Johnny Depp and kind of how they launched it. The reaction was what I would have expected it to be. People were very insulted by the fact that you have Johnny Depp dressed up in traditional indigenous wear and selling a perfume, and then the name of the perfume, which translated from, I believe it was French, translates into savage. So I think taking all of that and learning from it instead of trying to shove it like, oh, it didn't happen. Like they just pulled a commercial out and that was kind of like they wanted to end it. But it's more than pulling the commercial out. You have to acknowledge what you did and make sure you keep that in mind so that you don't come across the same mistake again.
I want to talk to you guys about how the media can better represent Native Americans.
Well, to kind of keep going on the perfume, I mean, we don't just have perfumes. We have movies. We have Halloween costumes. I mean, we just talked about Halloween last week. And the one thing I do have to say is last year I did see some people dressed up in, again, indigenous wear, going out and just being like, you know, I'm an Indian. And to really see a grown adult do that, it just, again, it threw me off. And I think it's part of that they don't really understand the history. I think if they understood it fully in context, then there wouldn't be such representation going across.
Yeah, the representation in the media you see is, I think it's good, but sometimes I think it's a little bit negative because I think that maybe the people who are doing it think they're doing it positive, but in reality I think they're doing it negative because I see that, especially in sports teams, a lot of sports teams that were called, let's give example, in the Major League Baseball, the Cleveland Guardians, as they're known now, they used to be called the Cleveland Indians a couple years ago. In the NFL, the Football League, the Washington Redskins, they were called, and now they're called the Washington Commanders. People saw it as a offensive term, calling him an Indian or calling him a Redskin, but the actual Native Americans, what I've seen from like actual Native Americans online saying like they don't like it being taken away because, you know, they don't have a lot of things left. So these things that they hang on to, the Redskins, the Indians, that's the one thing that they say represents them. So I don't agree with taking away a lot of the things like that. Yeah.
Okay, and do you guys have like any final thoughts on the matters?
I think just being open to have that discussion and learning a different side of the story, you know. That's what's something to keep in mind, whether it's for Indigenous Peoples Day or for any other topic. You got to stay open-minded.
Yeah. What I say is research things. Don't just assume the first thing you know or the first thing you see online because there's a big chance it could be fake, what they said. So that's my final thought is just research your things, know both sides, because if you don't know both sides, you're doomed to repeat what happened.
Again, we were here with Marc Monroy and Miriam Frutos Rodriguez. I want to thank you for watching On Point.